Welcome, I'm Darren, and I'll be your guide today as I talk about what may be the least well-known card set from the 1960s, Philadelphia brand. Now, Philadelphia cards were football cards. They were not made in basketball and they were not made in baseball, which is part of the reason why they're not really all that well known. And they occurred right during a kind of a confusing time in football card collecting due to the fact that there were now two leagues for this decade. There was the NFL, but they also had the AFL. And Fleer had launched into the card market in 1960 at the same time that the AFL joined. And so Fleer and Topps basically jockeyed for position as to which league each company was going to cover. And so for a pretty big swath of time, Topps was covering AFL cards. And after a couple of years, Fleer stopped making cards and Philadelphia took over for 4 years making NFL cards until Topps in 1968 brought both leagues together at same time as the NFL to create just one set again. So for these 4 years, Philadelphia made NFL cards, and it's the only time that you see Philadelphia cards. Now they do come back again 2 separate times in decades later, but not from the original company. So the original company was Swell. It's Philadelphia gum, and Swell is the brand that is most associated with the company. And Swell would come back around 1990 to do some Hall of Fame cards. So they didn't really care to get back into cards at any time. And so when Philadelphia ended in 1967, it basically disappeared off the map. And because of the brief time, and most importantly because of the fact that it was not in baseball, it basically slips under the radar, and you don't really talk about it all that much. Names like T208, Gowdy, National Chickle, these are names that still resonate much more clearly because there's a very broad market. And even old Fleer cards crossed all 3 major sports. So Philadelphia is a set that's easy to forget about. And yet, in a way, it's kind of ironic that that would be the case because due to the fact that for 4 years it was the only company making NFL cards, that means Jim Brown, Johnny Unitas, the rookie cards of Dick Butkus and Gale Sayers, those were all Philadelphia cards. They were not Topps, they were Philadelphia. So it is kind of strange that the name just doesn't resonate. And it presented a unique opportunity for the retro cards that would come in the late 90s and a decade later after that, in terms of one brand by Pacific and one brand by Upper Deck, which I'll talk about in a whole nother video because they're a very interesting story all on their own. But it meant that for companies that didn't have a history, this card brand basically gave them a unique opportunity. So I want to dedicate this video to looking just at these 4 years of Philadelphia cards. And the cards don't change a whole lot. They basically came up with one idea and made pretty much the same thing from year to year to year. But the variations are pretty strong, and this will definitely give you a good key, but it'll also help you to just understand what you will find in these cards. So the first thing I want to talk about is just the basic card design. The card design is very simple. It's a big picture, a very, very, very good portrait picture. And then it has a band of color, usually on the bottom, sometimes on the top, and that has the name, position, all that information on it. And that's the card front. Every single one of the 4 years uses that same card front with minor variations. Now the portraits really are good shots. They oftentimes will have clouds in the back, something like that. And ironically, in the case of 1964's Cleveland Browns team, they have a backdrop that is a street with some cars. That's it. It's literally a street in a city with some cars. It is a really weird approach that they would do. It's one of those backdrops that you have behind you in your school portraits. It's basically that kind of thing. But why they would go with just some general street with a chain link fence, no less, as their backdrop, I don't know. However, I have to admit, when I look at that picture, I think Cleveland. So they definitely succeeded with that. But at any rate, this is a really good set if you want to get good portraits. They really nailed it with these cards. Now I'll talk about what's common in the card backs as we go through. So I want to start off by talking about just the 1964 card. And this card is the template that all the other cards would be made off of. And the first 3 years have just a regular white border. So basically the picture and the box are just kind of floating in the card. They don't really get tied down with anything concrete. The card backs are, for 1964, a blue card back. It's actually two-tone, so there's blue tint and then there's some untinted cardstock, just basically kind of gray. And they have various information up at the top. They have the information about the player himself, and then they have 2 bands of statistics. They have the single year and they have the career totals. And then in a huge area down at the bottom, they have their question and answer. Now, every year they did these question and answers in different forms. And for 1964, they had both the question and the answer on the same card, and they had a cartoon in the middle to kind of enhance the portrait. So that's pretty much the design of the card, and that's the base card. The set was built team by team by team. So you start off with one team where you go through all the player cards, and then when you get to the end of the player cards, then you have a team card. And the team card is one of those classic portraits of the whole team standing there in front of the camera. And on the top, there's a band with the team name, and it has the team helmet and it has the team logo. Both of them are up on the top. And then on the back, they talk a little bit about how the season went for the team. And then they have a question and answer down at the bottom of that. So that's the team card. And then after the team card, they have a play card. And this is basically a particular play that the team ran at some point. And they have an X's and O's layout with all of the positions of movement that go on the card. And down at the bottom, they talk about what the two teams were when the play was held. And they have the coach on one side and the stadium on the other. So these are coach cards. So you're going to find Don Shula, you're going to find Vince Lombardi, you're going to find Georgios Halas. These guys are going to be on these cards, so they're not just team play cards, but they're actually coach cards as well, which is a neat little thing. And it's also fun to see what stadium they were playing in at that particular time. Now, on the back of the card, they talk a bit about who did what in the play. And then they have what looks like a team checklist, but it's not. It's actually key. It's the player number and then the player's name. So you can make the association on the back, the player to the number, on the front, the number to figure out where the player is. So you know where Billy Wade is, you know where Mike Ditka is, you know where every single player on the team's offense is at. And this is actually a really cool thing because it was helpful at the time because fans didn't really have as much access to information as we do today. So you got to actually see your offense laid out. But it's also helpful as a time capsule for us to look back and see what the team was like at that time. You can see exactly who was playing what position and where. So it's a fun little quirk that this card provides. After those two cards, so again, player card and then team play card, then you go on to the next team, the next team, and the next team, and the set completes with a couple of checklists. And each team comes in a different color. The color is not associated with the team, it's just different. So the first team has one color, the next team has another, the next team has another. So you can see where they transition from one to the other. And that is the set. That's all there is to the set. Now the packs did have tattoos or rub-ons, something of that fashion that they tended to have in the packs. But other than that, this is pretty much how this set was built, how it was presented and experienced. In 1965, they made a slight adjustment to the front, not much of one, but a slight one, where they took the box down at the bottom and they actually shrank the box, about the same proportions, but they shrank the box down, and instead of having it multiple colors, it's just black in this particular year. And then over in the space that they created on the right side of the card, they have the NFL logo. And this was the first year that they would put the NFL logo on, and they proved to love using the NFL logo. So it does make the card look a little bit more formal. The tightness at the bottom is a little stronger, and then the picture is slightly bigger for this particular year. But that's basically the change. It's not much of a change, but it is a distinctive change. So the first year is that big color box. The second one is the very staid black. On the card back, they did pretty much the same thing. They went with red this time. And the color tones changed position on the card. So it does look a little bit different in that way, but blue is the first year, red is the second year. And while the rest of the card is laid out in pretty much the same way, they did make a change in terms of the question and answer. Two big changes. First, they got rid of the comic and they replaced it with a rub-off. Now, it doesn't mean that they got rid of the comic, they just hid the comic under a rub-off. And then the other thing that they did was, instead of putting the question and the answer on the same card, they put the answer on another card. So that means that the question on your card is answered on another card, and likewise, the answer on your card answers a question that was on a whole different card. And they're scattered all over, so it inspires you to kind of collect the entire set in order to get all the questions and answers. Not that we really care, because we're not going to be rubbing them off, but it would be nice for somebody to put together a whole collection of all the questions on all of these cards, just so that we can go and see them if we're ever curious. It probably wouldn't be that difficult of a project to take on, because I know there are going to be a lot of rubbed off cards that are floating around, but someone's got to collect them. Now, probably the biggest difference for the 1965 set is the fact that they moved the team card from the back of the team to the front. So every team starts with a team card, and then it has the player cards, and then it has the play card. Other than that, it's largely the same. In fact, the play card is pretty much the same. The team card is pretty much the same. They changed some colors, but otherwise it is the same layout. And then likewise, you end with a couple of checklists. So 64 and 65 were very, very similar. 66, we'd see a bit more change. Actually, we'd see a lot more change. And it starts off with the base card. The base card takes the box at the bottom and it moves it up to the top. That's the first big change. They also expanded out the box and they took up the whole space now. And they actually wrapped around the NFL logo so that the NFL logo is contained within. So it creates a more uniform, a more formal card design overall. Everything's better contained. And this is the only year that they put the box up on the top. On the back, it's a green back, and this is where the biggest change is because the card back is now horizontal. And instead of having things stacked, they broke it into two sides. So on one side, they have player information, and then they have information about the season, but they don't have enough room now to put the stats, so they do a little write-up about the player. And over on the right, they have the comic, but in this case, it's not even a comic. They're still doing the question and answer spread across multiple cards, but now it's a player trivia. So you got to figure out who the player is. In order to find out, you got to go over to another card to find out who that is. And it's an interesting thing that they did because this is actually getting into a whole level of nerddom that they just didn't before. Before it was more for kids. Now it's getting more into being a real football fan. So it's a neat thing that they did. The team card is pretty much the same, still starts off the team. The play card, though, has changed significantly because now instead of being a particular play that they run and a description about it, etc., this is more like an in-action shot. It's more like the 70s and 80s Fleer cards. It's basically a shot of the team in action in the middle of a play, and on the back it talks about basically what the shot is showing you. So instead of going into diagnostics of a play, it's basically saying so-and-so is running around the end doing... It's more of a standardized card. It looks a lot better, so it's a lot easier for a collector to appreciate it, but it doesn't have the same interactive quality that had been present in the first 2 years. And also on the back of the card, they didn't go with the comic, they actually went with a referee signal. So that was a really interesting thing that they did on this card, and it actually makes sense for what they're doing. And it's a nice little nod that they did. Now they also, along with the checklist, have a referee card. And this is a neat addition that they made to the set. So they basically have all of these signals through the set, and then you have a referee card that kind of recaps in a way. For the final year, 1967, it was like they wanted to celebrate their 3 previous years. It was almost like they knew this was the end, because this is a recap card that combines everything that had been done before in various ways. They dropped the border back down to the bottom like the first 2 years, but they kept the full space like the previous year so that the picture and the color bar are tied together within the border, but now you actually have a border because they did a yellow border around the outside, so it looks like a more formal design. They also took the NFL logo out of the color band and they moved it out into the picture up in the top left. And this was an interesting thing they did because nowadays we tend to be used to seeing the card brand right on the front of the card. Well, they didn't usually do that in the past. That's something that really started popping up pretty prolifically in the 70s. And to see that in older cards is just very rare. You usually have to look at the copyright on the back to find out who did it. So here, they actually put the NFL logo up like it was a logo. I mean, they were really proud to be the brand for the NFL, but it does look kind of like a brand logo. The back of the cards are brown, but they're also horizontally oriented like 1966. But like 1965, they have a rub-off for their comic. And like 1964, they have the question and answer on the same card. So it's literally a combination of all the previous years. The team card at the front now has the referee signals on the back, so that's an interesting change that they made. And then they didn't get rid of the play cards, but they only did 3 play cards at the end of the set, just before the referee card and the checklist. So each team had not a play card, but they had a team history card. So on the front, it is the team logo, and on the back, it just talks about the history of the team. And every once in a while, there's a card like this where it just sits down and talks about the history of the team up to that point. And I think this is the first time that was done in football. I don't remember anybody else doing this beforehand. So it's a really neat card in that particular way. But that is pretty much what they did. That's the 4 years of Philadelphia. And it wouldn't be until 1997 that we would see the brand name reappear with a whole another company, which again I'm going to talk about in a whole nother video. But for these 4 years, these are the cards, and I actually think that these are the most 1960s card designs of the 60s. There are some pretty crazy things that were done in the 60s, and a lot of these cards feel like the 60s, but this to me looks like the way that the 60s felt for people who lived it, just everyday life, the way that everything around you looked in a very mundane way. This has that feeling to me of that. So in my opinion, this very well might be the best card design of the 1960s, at least the 65. That's definitely one of the best, if not the best. But it was a fun little run. It's one, again, that we tend to kind of overlook. We don't tend to talk about it very much. So it's good to take an opportunity to sit down and really look at these cards. And like I said, I think they're great. So feel free to mention how you think these cards are down in the comments below. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, I definitely encourage you to do so. Check out other videos that I've done, and hit the like button if you like this video. And thank you very much for watching.